All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Rudin, and I run the growth marketing and product growth org at Google. My team is responsible for making sure we optimize user acquisition, engagement, and retention across all of Google's products. Before Google, I had a role running the analytics organization for Facebook, and we were in the growth team. And then before that, I had a similar role at Zynga. I also had the good fortune to be in the early phases of the product and engineering team at Salesforce.com, and then started and sold two of my own companies. So I've had the opportunity to see what works and what doesn't in growth across a lot of different scenarios and several different companies. So what I'd like to do today is share some of that. And after the presentation, we'll have a Q&A. So if you have a question that comes up during the presentation, you can go to slido.com and event code 6039, and that number will appear every few slides if you forget it. So you can put your questions in there and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So I want to start with what do I mean when I'm talking about growth? And if there's nothing else that you remember, the main thing I want to leave you with from this presentation is that growth is a process. It's not black magic. It's not a set of clever hacks or tricks that you need to learn. It's not about finding that killer feature that's going to drive growth or the silver bullet. It's a process that if you repeat it, it will give you consistent growth. So with that in mind, the first key principle that I want to focus on is that growth, you really need to think about growth as a game of inches. And when you're thinking about what is really driving growth for a lot of companies, it's a lot of small wins rather than one or two big wins. And let me show you a graph here and give you some idea of what I'm talking about here. So when you look at companies that have consistently delivered growth year after year after year, and you look at what's driving their growth, it's much more about the aggregation of lots of small wins rather than one or two. So if you have something that looks like this, all right, where this is over time and this is, call it number of users or revenue or whatever, and if your growth curve looks like this, all right, so where should I look on this curve if this is representing number of users or revenue? Where should I be looking on this curve to figure out how to drive more growth? Okay, I heard beginning, all right. Right at the cusp, all right. Other thoughts about where I should be looking?
Everywhere.
Why? Everywhere was the answer. Why?
Just keep on going up.
That's right, it keeps on going up. So the natural inclination is to focus on how did we do that? Something really cool happened here. And generally, yeah, something cool did happen here. But if you look at the overall growth, the majority of the growth, if I drew that right, the majority of the growth is actually coming from, well, what happened here? Because we grew from here to here. And what happened over here? Because we grew from here to here. And what happened here and here and here? These are all the little inches. There are dozens and hundreds of these types of change that you can make to the product itself that will drive consistent growth. So if you get one of these, great. If you get one of these inflection points, great. But it's not what you want to be relying on for driving consistent growth. So, where did I put my clicker? Here it is. So, an example of this is something that we did fairly recently with Google Photos. This is a good example of one of these inches. When we looked at the data, what we found was that there was a particular feature that was highly correlated to really good engagement and really good retention, but the adoption of that feature was lower than we would have liked. And that feature was the ability to back up all the photos to the cloud and then remove the photos from the phone so you could free up space. The reason the adoption for that feature was low was because to get to it, it was in the settings menu, a few layers down, and it was called backup. So what we decided was this is an opportunity for us where we can really drive more growth. What if we were to take this feature and promote it more heavily in the app itself, combine that with a marketing promotion, let's see what can happen. So what we ended up doing is taking it from several levels deep in the settings to this is the main menu in the app now, and you can see right there it's the third one, free up space. We renamed it from backup to free up space. We also had a marketing campaign to promote this to people as well, that this is one of the main features here. And then we also coupled that with one other thing we did in the product, which was it would check how much memory is available in your phone and alert you when you're running out of space that you can use this feature to free up more space on your phone. So we did all of these things in conjunction. There was marketing parts, there were changes we made in the product to drive more people to this feature. And as a result, we got a significant increase in the number of people who adopted this feature, and we also got a significant increase in the average engagement and retention. So this is a great example of a fairly small change. The feature was already there. We just made it more accessible, we promoted it a little more, raised awareness, and it drives growth. It drove measurable growth. So things like this you can find again and again and again throughout the app itself, whatever app you're talking about. The second point I want to discuss is that the growth process begins and ends with data. In most companies, data is thought of as what you use to figure out and measure your actual growth. And yes, it is useful for figuring out and measuring your actual growth. But it's even more valuable to help you identify opportunities for growth. So it's not just a way to measure growth. Data is also a huge driver and a huge enabler to drive growth. So another way to think about this, if we talk about what the growth process is, I've been talking about it as a process, so let me cover that right now. It's really three fairly simple steps. The first phase is the understand phase. And what you want to do in that phase is get a really good understanding of everything you can about your product and everything you can about your users. So you're looking at things like, where are my users coming from? How successful is the onboarding process in generating engaged users or revenue generating users? Who is retained better and who is not? And how do I slice that by type of user and by geography and by platform? What features are people using and what features are they not using? One of the most important things you want to get out of this understand phase is what are the actions and what are the features in the app itself that is leading to the most engaged users and the users who convert the most into your paying customers, revenue driving customers, high valued customers. Then you move on to the second stage, which is identify, and the notion here, the goal here is to figure out where are there growth opportunities. And you're really looking for three things. The first thing you're looking for is for those sticky features that are driving engagement that I mentioned in the understand phase, or that are driving conversions, driving revenue, driving high valued users. Where do you have cases where you have those features, but they're being underutilized? Because the notion is if we can figure out a way, like we saw with the Photos app, to drive more of that, drive more usage of that, more adoption, we can get more growth. Another thing you're looking at is user flows. And a user flow is what I'll refer to as anything that is multiple steps within a product. So it can be anything from the onboarding process itself, how do you get people to sign up and then do what you need them to do for the onboarding process, to in the Photos app, maybe it's the process for creating a photo album. In a financial app, it can be something like how the process for how I transfer money from one account to another. All of these are user flows. What you want to do is look end to end and figure out for all the main ones you've got in the app itself, what are the completion rates of those flows? They're all going to look like a funnel where you start with 100 people, you're not going to get 100 people out the other end. Where in those steps are people falling out? And you want to identify which is, there's usually one step that is way worse than the rest. And so you want to find that step. And then the third thing you're looking at in this phase is anomalies and outliers, where you may find that there's a particular cohort of users that behaves very differently from everyone else, and you want to understand that more, because maybe you can find more of them. Or actually the most frequent thing you find when you're looking at anomalies and outliers is that it's caused by something that's busted in the product, that it may not be totally obvious. And a great way to drive growth by looking at the data there. Like an example there would be something like if I send out notifications in my app and the click-through rate worldwide is X%, but in Japan it's half of that. That's pretty odd, doesn't really seem to make sense. And this is a real example at one of my prior companies, and it turns out we had a bug in how we were encoding the notifications in Unicode. So they were getting garbled, and the carriers in Japan were not able to deliver them. So we were able to then go in and fix that, and you can drive more growth now because you've got more people seeing the notifications that you intended them to see in the first place. The final step is experiment. So you're taking these opportunities that you've identified and creating experiments and hypotheses about what you can do to take advantage of that opportunity. So in the first case, where you're finding really sticky features that are underutilized right now, you want to figure out what can we do to increase the utilization. And an example is when I was working with the Google search team, we found through the data that people who are searching for sports scores are really engaged. And makes sense because sports scores are constantly changing. It's pretty dynamic data. So if you're interested in that, you're going to be coming back fairly often to see the latest scores. But there were fewer people who than we would have liked and would have expected who were using that capability in search. So you need to come up with a hypothesis about what can we do to get more people to use it. So I know a lot of you people are products. Throw out some ideas. What would you do? Sorry, I know you didn't avert your eyes, and that was a fatal mistake. So,
I was looking at the floor. What are you talking about?
well, you know, close enough, all right? Close enough. So an idea, what might you do if you want to get more people in search to realize that you can actually get sports scores? How would you do it?
Split.
I'm putting you on the spot. Okay, you can phone a friend.
I can phone a friend.
Yeah, no, sorry.
No, I'm not going to phone a friend. I can do this myself. One thing that I've always found useful with Google to show what they can do is how they change the doodle.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, they change their doodle to something that's relevant for that day. So if there's a big game or something like that, you can change the doodle to use the team logos.
Right,
like
right.
that.
You click on that.
Draw
Okay.
them versing each other.
Other ideas, good. I like that one. Other ideas? We didn't think of that one, but actually, yeah.
You're welcome.
Yes.
If you know where the user is located, you know what major sports teams are on, and the surface of sport is at the top already.
All right. So the notion there was if you know where they're located, you can surface the popular teams, the scores kind of at the top of whatever interface. Was okay, in the back there. I'll take like one or two more. This is useful actually because this is things we need to do. So thank you for your ideas. Yes.
So what are the substitute behaviors when they search for sports scores? Like maybe they're searching for ESPN and you can put a do you know on the side.
Right, okay, so if they're searching for things like ESPN, say, do you know that you can also get sports? So that's one of the things we actually did end up doing, which we called it adjacent information. If you're looking for something related to sports, if you're searching for the history of David Beckham or Pele, at the bottom of the results we can say, by the way, did you know you can also get sports scores? So yes, so these are the types of things that you're trying to do in the question.
I was going to throw out another idea.
Oh, go ahead, I got to hear it.
Highlighted if they search for the team or if they're searching for like tickets or something.
Yeah, if they're searching for the team or tickets, yes. So the point is, there's a feature, it's not getting used as much. Get creative in how can we surface this? And then also, you get a double benefit if you can then couple that with a marketing campaign as well. For the photos one, I think if you guys were watching things around the Olympics, they had a lot of TV ads about running out of space on your phone and getting more space. So these are the types of things you can do there. And if you have a flow and people are getting stuck in step 3 and falling out of that, can we remove the friction? Can we redesign that step? Can we remove that step entirely? These are the types of things you're trying to do here. You keep going through this loop again and again. It's very much an experiment and iterate, experiment and iterate. That's how you can drive some significant growth. And data is the foundation of it. So here's an example of where we use data to really help drive growth, where if we had not been looking at it up front, we would have done something very different. So this is, we're talking here about Android Pay. And specifically, we were looking at the user flow, the main user flow in Android Pay, which is about signing up, creating an account, entering your credit card, and then going to a store and using Android Pay to actually purchase something. Now, when I've been involved in these types of flows before, the main step where people fall out, where do you think people are most likely to fall out in that process? Enter your credit card, right. That's historically and usually what it is. In this case, it wasn't. I don't exactly know why, but I think probably because this was an app about paying and people kind of expected that if they're going to sign up for it, they're going to enter their credit card, so it's a little bit of a self-selecting process. But regardless, we were doing, actually, when we looked at the data, quite well in getting people to that step. However, there was a huge growth opportunity in the step after that, which is now that you've set everything up and you're ready to go, actually go use it to purchase something. And it was a little unexpected that they go through that whole process and then potentially just not use it at all. And so we had to come up with, so that was, we looked at the data, we then identified there was an opportunity here that we can grow getting more people to use that particular feature and getting more people to actually go and pay, which is the main flow in the app itself. But one more time, I'm doing this to keep you all awake after lunch. Some ideas about why they may not be getting to that last step, where there are things that you can do about it. Yes?
Social reasons maybe, like not wanting to ask somebody at the register, like where do I put this, where do I put my phone, how do I use this?
Okay, just the embarrassment factor of not actually knowing how to do it. All right, what might you do in the app to try and fix that? Is there something you can do?
Maybe after they set it all up and everything, integrate like a cute graphical user flow of how they would actually use it in the store.
So instruction on how they need to do it, so they're not embarrassed when they first try and do it and fail. Yes, one more.
Force of habit. You know, you're just used to using your credit card to pay, so even though you have that set up, you just don't think about it.
Okay, force a habit, you're not used to using it. So what would you do potentially in the app to change that?
Push a notification when you notice.
Exactly, maybe you send a notification. Yeah, okay, one more.
The worst being, it's not an actual value prop.
Okay, well it could be it's not an actual value prop, and we would know that's a wholly different problem, a significant one it could be, but that's a wholly different thing, and what you'd want to find out there is to people who are using it, because there's certainly some people who are using it, just we wanted to get even more. And if those people aren't even retained either, then you really have a problem. You don't have good product market fit. You're retaining no one. The main hypothesis that we came up with was that people don't know where to use it. So along the lines of what the woman in the back said before, is okay, I've got it, and I'm in a store, I don't even know they can use it. So what about doing things like sending out an email once a month that says, here's the places in your neighborhood that use it, or sending you a notification when you're in a store that can use it to let you know. These are all different things you can experiment with, and we tried lots of those. Several of them worked, and we were able to drive growth again. And this is a case where I use this as an example of data driving growth, because if we hadn't been looking at the data up front, we would probably still be focusing on how to get more people to enter their credit cards rather than helping people find out where they can actually use this product in a store to purchase something. The challenge with using data, though, is the data sets historically have been really siloed. So we've got marketing analytics, which tells you about your campaigns and how many downloads, for example, that resulted in, or impressions. And then you've got product analytics, which is very separate about what's going on in the product itself. What are the behaviors users are doing? You don't want to just know which campaign drove the most downloads. You want to know which campaign drove the most engaged users, the highest value users, the users that converted most frequently into a paying customer. Those are the types of things you want to know. But it's been really hard. So Google decided to solve this problem, and we released not that long ago, earlier this year, a free product, and that's the Firebase Analytics product. And as a prior analyst, I've been fairly impressed with this product. It gives you not only information about attribution for everything going on in marketing and in the product analysis side, crashes and what behaviors people are doing most frequently, All those things that you typically expect in the silos are all there, but it also can tell you which campaigns are driving the most engaged users, the highest value users, which really helps simplify a problem that most of you have probably been struggling with for quite a while. Moving on to the third and final point that I want to make. When you're thinking about growing a product, first get retention right, then focus on acquisition. And as marketers, that's often hard for us or a little bit counterintuitive because the beginning of the process is acquiring users. And I'm sure we've all been in a situation where somebody's saying we have to grow next year and we need to drive growth more. How much more can we add to the marketing budget? And as marketers, that's always great, but you've all heard about the leaky bucket analogy where if you are acquiring more users and spending more money on acquiring users that you aren't able to retain, you're just pouring a lot of water into a very leaky bucket. So you have to focus on getting the retention right first. So how do you know when you've got good retention? What are your thoughts on how you can tell if you've got good retention? Yes?
Repeat users.
Okay, repeat users. All right. Any particular tools people use or methods that they've used in the past that help identify what their retention is? Yes, in the back.
Cohort analysis.
Cohort analysis. Okay. I'll take that to mean retention curves in cohorts. Okay. So yeah, the way, I think the most effective and very simple way of looking at it is looking at a retention curve. And so this looks something like this again, where this is time at the bottom. This is percentage of people, and typically with any luck, your curve looks something like that. What this is showing is this is a cohort of people who started using your app or your solution on a particular day. So this is day one. This is their very first day that they use the app. And this is telling what percentage of the people on each subsequent day of that fixed cohort. Let's say there's 100 people in that cohort. So on this day, by definition, to get into the cohort, they had to use it that day. So that's 100% of the people use it on day one. How many have come back on each day? If on this day, 55 of that original 100 came back, that's 55%. And on this day, if it's 36 came back out of that original 100, 36%. So looking at this, how do we know if we do or don't have good retention in our app, if we've got product market fit? Thoughts on this? Like, what is the key thing you're looking for here? Yes? For it to flatten out. Right. So the key thing is you want this part to be flat. Very, very frequently, it's a little bit unnerving, so I wouldn't do it around the holiday time. Wait till after that. What your retention curve looks like, if you haven't ever looked at it before, is it just kind of keeps going like that. You want it to flatten out. Now, somebody pointed out that it never gets totally flat, and that's true because if you wait long enough, all your users end up dying, and so it will go to 0. However, it has to be pretty flat. Okay, so it has to go flat. Where? What's good retention? Throw out a number. What's that?
First week.
First week, but it flatten out in the first week? Okay, won't flatten out in the first week. So we want it to flatten out. I haven't put any numbers here. Like what should that number be?
25.
25, okay. Other numbers?
30%.
35.
40.
40 would be nice. I got 40. 40, do I hear 45?
Depends on your business.
What's that?
Depends on your business.
Ah, okay, it depends. Depends on what?
If you sell mattresses, and you have an app that sells mattresses, you're not going to expect someone to...
All right, if you have an app that sells mattresses, your number is going to be different than if you have an app that is a daily use app. And that's really the best way to think about it. So though I am, my background is as an analyst, and it pains me not to label my y-axis, I intentionally don't label it because it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't matter where it flattens out. And the main reason why is because where it will intersect this y-axis is by far mostly driven by how you have defined an active user or a retained user. If you have a very loose definition, that line goes up. If you have a very strict definition, like they have to have bought something in the last 30 days, not just use the app, then it goes down quite a bit. So you can move this line up and down a lot by changing the definition. Obviously, that doesn't change anything going on in your app, but what you won't change by doing that is the shape. So the key thing is to look for it to flatten out. So that's the notion of thinking about retention before acquisition. And this is really important because there's lots of studies like this one that show that somewhere between 15 and 17% of your users are driving 85% of the revenue. And it's even more important because most apps, the vast majority of our apps, are actually free. So you need to figure out how you find that 17% of users who are going to be the right users. Because if you've got good retention, great. Now you've got an app that can hold some set of people who come into it initially. Now the goal is to find more of those people that fit in this area. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you have to do is figure out what are you actually looking for. And there's lots of different things depending on the app. So if it's a dating app, you're looking for people who are going to like someone's profile. If it's a shopping app, you're looking for people who put things into a cart. If it's a games app, you're looking for people who are going to buy virtual currency. But the challenge is, all right, what are the actions that are most correlated with these conversion events that I really like? What are the right channels in terms of finding people like that? What are the channels? What are the messages? What's the ad format I want to use? What's the right time to send it? There are a lot of signals, and it's a very, very complicated process to try and figure it out. So Google's approach to this is to solve this problem through a product that we've got called Universal App Campaigns, and it's a product within the AdWords product itself. And it does some pretty cool stuff. It looks at all of those signals about the actions users are taking, and it looks at attributes of users, and it looks at the context of when and where and what app were they potentially using when they did these actions. It takes all of those signals and puts it into a machine learning algorithm to figure out what are the users you want to find, what are the best channels, what are the best ad formats, when do you want to target them that's going to be optimized. It also helps figure out how much should you be bidding on each of these channels in each of these options. So it takes a very complicated problem and pretty dramatically simplifies it. So I've been pretty impressed with it. So those are the 3 points I wanted to cover. And just to wrap up, to remind you of what those 3 points are, remember, growth is a game of inches. It's not about the home run. It's not about coming up with that brilliant creative idea. It's about iterating through a process again and again and just consistently getting another inch and another inch. And remember that use data up front. Don't just use data to measure your growth. Use data to drive your growth. And the last one is retention before acquisition from 2 perspectives. You want to make sure that you've got an app that can retain users, and you want to make sure that you can find those users who will be retained. So that's what I wanted to cover today. Thank you very much. Now, I mentioned that we have this Slido, and you can enter your questions. You can ask some questions now. Let's get into the Q&A. And at this point, I'd like to invite up Lee Jones, who's going to be the moderator, and also Belinda Langner, who's going to join me. And we'll take questions from Slido and as well the audience itself. All right, grab that chair.
All right, great. Thank you, Ken. Apologies up front, I'm losing my voice. Not ideal today. But listen, we've got a ton of great questions here in Slido already. If you have others that come to mind, please just send them to the form that we put up before. Actually, Ashley, could we go back and maybe just keep the Slido link up?
Okay.
Oh, it's up. Okay, never mind. Perfect. So the first question, I think this is for Ken. What metrics does Google use across products to measure the effectiveness of your growth efforts?
We look at what we call growth accounting overall, which is stolen from financial accounting. which is, in finance, you've got the dollars today equals the dollars yesterday that you had yesterday, plus any new dollars that came in, and minus any minus any expenses. So putting that in the framework of users, because in many of our products, we are looking at users as a measure of growth, but I'll also talk a second about that as well. But we're looking at what users we had today. So the total number of users we had today, new acquisitions, and then how many people churned today, and also how many people were reactivated. Churn, in our definition, is someone who hasn't been active for at least 28 days, and someone who, we call them reactivations, is someone who was churned but came back. They behave fairly differently than a brand new user. And when you're looking at what's driving growth, if growth is slowing down, you want to know, or let's say growth is speeding up, is it because acquisitions are going up? Or maybe acquisitions are flat, but reactivations are skyrocketing. Or maybe its churn is dropping. So each of those three areas, you want to have different tactics, and you will have different tactics of how to address that. And often it's a combination of the three of those. But the way you address it, don't just think about, oh, growth is going up, that's good. It may be going up because, yeah, acquisitions is doing great, but that's hiding the fact that churn is also growing really quickly, and you need to address that as well. Not quite as quickly as acquisitions, which is why you're still seeing growth, but it's becoming a problem. I think the other part of the question is, so what are the metrics we use? So it does very much depend on the product. For something like search, it's daily active users. For something like our Allo chat product, it's number of messages sent. For something like YouTube, the main metric for growth, kind of we call it the North Star metric, for all of these is view time. How many hours per day are people watching YouTube videos? And then if you look at other companies, the growth teams all interact. So things like Uber, it's number of rides taken. For Airbnb, it's number of nights booked. For something like Wealthfront, it's dollars under management. So it's not always about user. And it's really important to figure out what that is first and make sure all your efforts are driving towards that.
The next question here is really, once you've figured a lot of that out, how do you keep users engaged and coming back? So not only understanding, making smart acquisition, but retention.
Right, so how do you keep them retained? Two main approaches that we use. One is, I talked about here, there's several things you can do, but one of the most powerful ones is, everyone thinks about building out new features, and as an ex-engineer, I totally get that. It's really fun to build new features. But if you can change the mindset of, well, what about getting your existing features to actually be used by everyone? So one of the biggest engagement drivers, it came up in the example with photos, was just the general category of feature awareness. Find the great features you probably already have in your app that people just aren't using enough. Focus on more entry points to that feature, just making it easier to find the front door. Remove friction in using that feature. Promote it more. So that's one thing in the app. And then outside the app, particularly for churned users, and you want to bring them back, and also existing users who are kind of less frequent users, re-engagement advertising. So advertising should not be thought of solely as acquisition. You can also use it if they're not using the app, it's kind of hard to reach them in the app. And if they don't have notifications turned on, a great channel you do have is using ads to drive re-engagement.
Yeah, and tying that to basically after you've improved the app in some way, right? And like using your creative to say something like, hey, like I've made these great improvements. Is just a really great way just to remind the user why they should re-engage with the app, especially if they didn't have maybe the greatest experience earlier, or they just forgotten about your app for whatever reason.
Great. The next question is, how do you design your ad products to help companies drive growth? Ken, you mentioned earlier that you used to be in the actual search product org thinking about growth. Right. Belinda, you're a product manager on our growth products. Maybe you could start by thinking or how we connect the dots between marketing and our actual ad products.
Actually, I think it actually is a better question for you to answer. I think because it would just be redundant. Sure. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of what we're trying to do and how we're thinking about designing our ad products is really to make sure that we're able to drive the users, drive you to find users that you want, right, that are really highly qualified. So Ken talked about this a little bit earlier, right, in his presentation, and we're changing UAC, right, to really find users that are more like the complete
Universal app campaign.
Oh, universal app campaign. Sorry, thank you. To complete certain actions, right, within your app. And so, if you're trying to develop this feature and trying to get people to a certain level within your game, or trying to get people to make an in-app purchase, we're trying to create our campaigns now to really find users for you that are likely to complete those events. And that's our goal, to find you the right users for your app.
Cool. The next question here is, testing and iterating is a great philosophy, but the challenge is often prioritizing what's most important. How do you suggest we figure out what to test first? So maybe for both of you again.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one. The traditional approach, which doesn't work so well, is you get people in a room, they brainstorm, put Post-it notes on a whiteboard, and then people vote on it. That's certainly better than nothing, but it's predominantly driven by gut instinct, and often driven by what I call the HIPPO, which stands for highest paid person's opinion. It's the person who can pound their fist on the table the hardest or talks the loudest. So it's not a great way of doing it. There is this, you can find stuff about this online, but the optimal way to do it is to build something called a growth model, which is you start with what is your overall thing that you're trying to move, whether it's daily active users or messages sent or dollars under management, and then you break that down into what are the things that affect that? What are the input variables that affect that? And you build, actually it turns out to be a very simple spreadsheet. And the beauty of that is it's totally data-driven, totally repeatable, and the primary value is it helps you prioritize. Because you can say, well, if my conversion rate for viral invitations is at 6% now, I think I can get that to probably 10%. What impact would that have? Versus, what if I change something else and improve that? You have a very simple spreadsheet, and you can show people this is why we're doing this, because it's expected to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think data is the biggest thing, right? Like Ken talked about, it's really important to make sure you understand your data and your metrics to really know what is going to drive the biggest impact for you, right? And so really understanding kind of how folks are reacting within your app, what are some of the biggest factors, and a lot of just testing and kind of getting more experience too of how people are reacting is just really going to help kind of drive some of that instinct, and documenting it, right, in a spreadsheet of sorts helps that knowledge kind of carry through for everybody, and you can kind of learn from other teams as well.
So maybe related to that is, the question is, how is your team set up? And how does it work across product and marketing?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, how is the growth team set up?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Or I'm assuming that's what the question
means. And maybe also any advice you would give to people from your previous background as well.
I think there's two things that I guess they're kind of related. I'm a big fan of having a growth team. It can be usually within the product teams themselves, and I'll talk about what my team does, but usually a growth team within the product team that is separate from the core product team. Meaning they're still in the same umbrella, but they focus on things that are different. The second thing I was going to explain why in a second, but the second thing that's related to that is the people in the growth team are 100% dedicated to it. I think it is a real struggle to try and get everyone in the team to focus both on building out new features as well as doing this iterative process for growth. Fundamentally, they have different processes and different ways of thinking about it. You want the core product people to focus on expanding the functionality and the usability and the capabilities of the product. Their starting point is the product vision. The growth team and the engineers in that team and so on, their starting point is that thing I was talking about, the growth model, which is looking at the data, here's what we need to do to focus on growth. And two more things that I think are pretty different. In the core product team, their main process is develop and launch, and then go into the next product, develop and launch. And what you want and they're measured by launches generally, in terms of their performance reviews and so on. Whereas the growth team, their focus is experiment and iterate. Much faster usually, but experiment and iterate. It's not about launching new features. So they're measured on direct impact on the metrics that we're trying to move. So in most companies, I would set it up that if you've got big product areas, focus on carving out a small team. Start with one product manager, 2 engineers, 1 designer, and 1 analyst. That's kind of the core team you need to just get started, but have them 100% focused on these types of things. What my team does within Google is we are helping, I helped create a team like that in search, and it was working reasonably well, so the notion was we need to replicate that. So really the focus of my team is helping other product teams build their own growth organizations, and then we continue to share knowledge between them and drive best practices for driving growth.
Here's one. Building on your hippo comment, how do you combat the hippo when they don't believe the data?
Oh, man. Yeah, leave, right, join a new team. No.
Find a bigger hippo?
Find a bigger hippo. I think a lot of what I try to do in the past is when people don't really believe in the growth process itself, because it's a very new process and it's a new habit you have to form. I think the notion is do it as a skunkworks project and just show that it works. Not easy to do. It's not a great situation to have someone who just doesn't believe the data. But I think that then the only thing you really can do is just see if you can get in something small, right? I was talking about these inches. Some of these, like at one of my prior companies, we had one of these sign-up pages in India. You had to choose a language that you wanted the overall interface to be in. And we had English US, English UK, Hindi, and then in other ... You'd click on it, it would give you 87 other languages. I don't know why we had English and English as 2 of the 3 options, but we did. And somebody noticed that's kind of stupid. So they just changed it, and this takes, I don't know, 10 lines of code maybe to change it, and it was changed to English, Hindi, Tamil, and then more ... And we saw then that like a 3% or 4% increase in the percentage of people who were completing the sign-up flow. So that's a tiny little inch, and it's a small-ish win. But if you're thinking about number of users per lines of code you had to change there and hours you had to invest, that's a great win. Do those all day long. That's the kind of thing you can do and just say, look, it actually does work. I know you're not believing the data, but you're believing the growth anyway. So I think that's your best option.
So make incremental changes to prove it before.
That's right. Yeah. Just prove it and incrementally with small things. You don't need a big thing.
That's in your control.
Right.
Yeah, or if you can find something that your hippo really cares about, like they're passionate about, or something that they care more about, you can try to focus your efforts there too. Just because if they're naturally invested in that space, they're going to want to believe some of these growth changes a little bit more too.
Yeah. I'm impressed with the real-time Slido.
I know, it keeps changing too, so give me a second. So here's a question about universal app campaigns for Belinda. Let's see, it just moved again. How does the universal app campaign distinguish between causation or correlation that leads up to a particular event like an in-app purchase?
Yeah. So the whole goal of universal app campaigns is kind of working with you and your analytics team to sort of understand kind of what events are important. So what we're relying on is for you to let us know which events you think are going to lead to really popular events that you care about, right? So if we take like a gaming app, for instance, right, some people have said when they reach, a certain level that a user is more engaged, right, and they're more likely then to make an in-app purchase. And so a lot of this is just using, some of your either, Firebase or another third-party analytics program to kind of understand the data, really understand your app, how users are flowing through your app, to sort of really get at the core of what leads to an event. Our goal isn't necessarily we're trying to find new people who are completing a certain event, and if it's, if it is reaching level 5, that's great, or if it's, people who complete a certain tutorial, that's great as well. So it's really about kind of working with you to find that event, and trying out different things to kind of explore out which events work, and it's a very iterative process, right? A lot of this is just trying out events that work, seeing kind of what happens, and as you change your app, right, things might also change on making which events kind of are more likely to lead to purchase events, or whatever event you care about.
So you might, you want to understand who your whales are, not your hippos.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Gaming term. Okay. I think we have time for one more. Is that right? Okay. So the last question that was just voted up a lot was, what tactics does Google practice to reactivate churned users, especially since it's statistically much more difficult to acquire a churned user versus a new user? So how should you think about that differently?
Yeah.
Or should you go after churned users?
Oh, no, you definitely should go after churned users. And a prior company I worked at, it was absolutely critical to growth. We were getting about 1 million new signups a week. We were getting about 5 million people churning a week. You think, okay, well, that's bad. But we were getting 4.5 million reactivations a week.
Wow.
So in terms of what you might call new, or just the inflow, 1 million from new users, 4.5 million, over 4 times from reactivations. So particularly when your user base gets large, it's certainly less of an issue for products that are newer, but when the size of your existing base dominates any new inflow, churn is going to be high, because churn is generally a percentage of the base, whereas acquisition generally isn't. That's not always true, but generally it isn't. So you have to focus on that. And one of the things you need to do to successfully reactivate someone, the tactics we talked about a little bit. There are the reactivation campaigns. If they do have notifications turned on, you can still do that. You can still use notifications. But the main thing is, if you bring them back to the app the way it was, because you just want them back, they're generally going to leave again for exactly the same reason they left before. So a really good time to bring them back is when there is something new about the app, or something new about the way they can interact with it, that will bring them back and make them stay. Something has to be different. It can be something like your friend X is now also using this app and you can share photos with them. Or it can be a new feature or whatever it is, but try and preserve it to something that is different so they won't get the exact same experience, because that will lead to the exact same result.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Ken. Thank you, Belinda. Appreciate it.